Well, hello and welcome back to class. This is Applied Anatomy, AAP 301 for the College of Natural Health Sciences, Bermuda. My name is Dr. Dalcina Bean Burrows, and this is lecture number 18, where we will be looking at the ear, specifically auditory and the vestibular systems. The lecture objectives for Lecture 18 are that at the end of today's lecture, students will become familiar with the anatomy of the outer, middle, and inner ear, understand the anatomy and physiology of hearing, be familiar with the anatomy of the vestibular system, understand the anatomy and physiology of static and dynamic equilibrium, be familiar with the effects of aging on the auditory system, and be familiar with common ear pathologies. We begin our lecture today by looking at the anatomy and physiology of hearing from the Visible Body ebook. The ears collect sound waves and convert them to nerve impulses. Let's follow a sound wave and its journey from entering the ear to being transduced to electrical signals and interpreted by the brain. The outermost part of the ear is the fully visible auricle. Most of the auricle is composed of cartilage, although the lower part, which is the lobule or earlobe, is made of loose connective tissue and fat. Like a satellite dish sticking off the side of the head, the auricles collect sound waves and funnels them into the external auditory canal. And here is one fact: earwax, which is also referred to as cerumen, helps prevent infections in the internal auditory canal by trapping foreign particles. Now let's look at the middle ear. Sitting at the entrance of the middle ear is the tympanic membrane, that is, the eardrum. When sound waves strike it, it vibrates just like when your hand or a mallet strikes the head of a drum. The vibrations from the eardrum are passed on to the three tiny bones of the middle ear, the auditory ossicles, starting with the malleus or hammer. The eustachian tube, also known as the auditory tube of the pharyngeal tympanic tube, equalizes pressure in the middle ear with the pressure of outside ear. Once the malleus gets going, the incus or anvil is the next bone in the vibration chain. Lastly, the vibrations pass to the stapes from the incus. The stapes presses on the oval window, one of two openings between the middle ear and the inner ear. The other such opening is the round window. Here's an interesting fact: the stapes is the smallest bone in the human body. Now let's look at the double labyrinth, the inner ear. Did you know that the inner ear technically contains two labyrinths? The bony labyrinth is a series of cavities, the semicircular canals, the vestibule, and the cochlea. The bony labyrinth is filled with a fluid called perilymph. Within the bony labyrinth is a network of membranous sacs and ducts known as the membranous labyrinth. It contains another fluid called endolymph. The cochlea is where the cochlear portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve picks up the auditory signals. It has three fluid-filled channels: the scala vestibuli, the scala tympani, and the cochlear duct, which is also referred to as the scala media. When the stapes pushes on the oval window, pressure waves are created in the perilymph of the scala vestibuli. The cochlear duct contains hair cells located in the spiral organ, which is the organ of Corti. Each hair cell is topped with 40 to 80 stereocilia. When the pressure waves in the perilymph make the basilar membrane vibrate, the hair cells are pushed up against the tectorial membrane, bending the stereocilia. This opens mechanically gated ion channels, creating an action potential by depolarizing the hair cells. This action potential passes to the cochlear nerve. Let's talk about pitch perception. The higher the frequency of a sound wave, the higher its pitch. Different regions of the basilar membrane respond to different frequencies. For example, the narrower, stiffer portion of the membrane, located near the oval window, will only move in response to a higher frequency pressure wave. Based on the location of the hair cells sending its sensory information, the brain determines the frequency, pitch of a sound. Now let's discuss hearing and the brain. The first destination for signals traveling up the vestibular cochlear nerve is the brainstem, the cochlear nucleus of the medulla oblongata to be exact. The signal subsequently continues on its way through the auditory pathway, moving from the brainstem to the midbrain, the thalamus, and on to the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Now let's discuss the various types of hearing loss. According to the American Speech and Language Hearing Association, there are 3 basic types of hearing loss. Hearing loss can be present in people of any age, from infants to the elderly. The first is conductive hearing loss, which usually involves infection, fluid buildup, injury, or obstruction in the outer or middle ear. A missing outer ear or a problem with the structure of the ear canal or auditory ossicles can also lead to conductive hearing loss. Sensory neural hearing loss, which involves damage to the inner ear or problems with the neural connection between the ears and the brain, is the most common type of permanent hearing loss. This type of hearing loss can even have a variety of causes, such as illness, head injury, aging, or problems with the formation of the inner ear. Sensory neural hearing loss can even run in families. Mixed hearing loss happens when sensorineural and conductive hearing loss co-occur. Now let's discuss hearing aids and cochlear implants. Hearing aids may help many people with hearing loss. A typical hearing aid contains a microphone to pick up sounds, an amplifier to make those sounds louder, and a receiver to send the amplified sounds to the ear. Cochlear implants help people who have damaged their hair cells in their inner ears. Essentially, a cochlear implant contains a speech processor that picks up sounds and converts them to digital signals. These signals are then passed to the electrodes inside the cochlea, which stimulate the auditory nerve directly. Time now for our first and only What Do You Think segment. And remember, the What Do You Think segments are designed to help develop your clinical reasoning skills. Some people prefer to have background music playing while they are studying, while others prefer to have complete quietness. How would you account for these differences? Now let's discuss aging and the auditory system. With aging, there is a decrease in the number of neurons in the cochlear nuclei and auditory centers of the brain. There is also a reduction in the size of cells and changes in the neurochemical makeup of the cells. This is associated with a decline in the ability of the central auditory system to process sound. Some of the changes in the central auditory system may be attributable to the effects of the loss or attenuation of neural input from an impaired peripheral auditory system. These effects combine with general biological aging within the brain to produce the difficulty seen. A number of pathologies that accompany aging may affect the auditory pathways, including arteriosclerosis, anoxia, and metabolic dysfunction of the liver or renal system, and free radical-induced damage. A result of the changes in the central auditory system is that for many older people, the difficulties in understanding speech are greater than would be expected solely from the audiometric threshold. A further difficulty is noticed when there is background noise requiring more complex auditory processing. A consequence of the changes in central auditory processing with aging is that simple amplification of external sound with a hearing aid will not always fully correct the hearing disability experienced by the person. While changes in the central auditory system will contribute to age-related hearing loss, it is thought that they have less of an impact on hearing in the elderly than the changes in the cochlea described above. Studying the effects of genetic inheritance on age-related hearing loss alone is difficult, as most people have been exposed to other insults to the auditory system. There are a large number of genes coding for the cochlea. However, some evidence is emerging to support a genetic predisposition to both age-related hearing loss and susceptibility to environmental damage. Mitochondrial DNA has been implicated in both of these types. While the aging process itself is associated with degeneration of the auditory system, other insults to the cochlea form noise or autotoxic drugs can accumulate over a lifetime and contribute to the decline in hearing experienced by older people. In addition, otological conditions such as Meniere's disease or otosclerosis that can affect patients of any age also need to be considered. Autotoxicity as a cause of hearing loss may often be unrecognized. It has been estimated that up to 30% of elderly patients presenting with hearing impairment are taking potentially autotoxic drugs. Furthermore, in addition to the drugs that are regularly associated with autotoxicity, there are many other drugs that are potentially autotoxic. The underlying mechanism of autotoxicity varies with different drugs. Other drugs, such as loop diuretics or beat blockers, may produce a reversible hearing loss. The clinical picture will depend on the drug taken. Drug-induced autotoxicity in the elderly is thought to be more significant as a cause of hearing loss than in other groups for a number of reasons. High use of autotoxic drugs, impaired renal function, or an increased susceptibility to autotoxic drugs are all potential explanations of why this is so. Now let's take a deeper look at the vestibular system. The vestibular system has important sensory and motor functions contributing to the perception of self-motion, head position, and spatial orientation relative to gravity. To look closer at vestibular anatomy, let's begin by considering the peripheral sensory apparatus. It detects and relays information about head angular and linear velocity to the central processing system. It orients the head with respect to gravity. The central processing system processes information in conjunction with other sensory inputs for position and movement of head in space. And the motor output system generates compensatory eye movements and compensatory body movements during head and postural adjustments. Buried deep in the temporal bone, The main peripheral component of the vestibular system is the elaborate set of interconnected chambers, the labyrinth, which is continuous with the cochlea. The labyrinth consists of two otolith organs, the atricle and the saccule, and three semicircular canals. The vestibular hair cells, like the cochlear hair cells, produce minute displacements into relevant receptor potentials and are located in the atricle and saccule, and three jug-like swellings called the ampulla, located at the base of the semicircular canals next to the atricle. In the atricle and saccule, the sensory epithelium, the macula, consists of hair cells and associated supporting cells overlying the hair cells, and their stereocilia is a gelatinous layer. Above this layer is a fibrous structure, the Autolithic Membrane, in which are embedded crystals of calcium carbonate called autoconia, the crystals that give the otolith organ the name. Otolith is Greek for ear stones. The otolith make the ontoconial membrane considerably heavier than the structures and fluids surrounding it. Thus, when the head tilts, gravity causes the membrane to shift relative to the sensory epithelium. Now let's consider static equilibrium. The ear also lets your brain know whether you are reclining on your sofa or standing up. In other words, it senses changes in position. This is called static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is sensed in the vestibule. Inside the vestibule are the two structures that we've been talking about, the atricle and the saccule, which contain the hair cells. The hair cells are located in structures called the macula and connect to a membrane called the Autolithic Membrane. The membrane contains small stone-like structures called the otoliths embedded in the membrane that has rocks on it. When you change position, the rocks pull on the membrane and bend the hair cells. This motion is converted to action potentials and sent to the brain. Once in a while, the rocks get out of position, causing a condition called benign positional vertigo. Not to worry though, because they can be put back into place with a relatively simple maneuver called the otolith repositioning. Now let's consider dynamic equilibrium. The semicircular canals are filled with fluid. At the base of each semicircular canal is a bulge called the ampulla. Inside the ampulla is a structure called the crista ampullaris. Inside each are hair cells. Each semicircular canal is filled with fluid. The fluid moves when you move, causing the hair cells to bend. The bending is once again translated to action potentials and sent off to the brain. Sometimes the fluid keeps moving even when you are stopped. Think of spinning someone in a rotating chair. When you abruptly stop the chair, the fluid will continue to move, causing a sensation of dizziness. And here are some common pathologies of the ear. Acoustic neuroma is a benign tumor that develops from the 8th cranial nerve, which is also referred to as the vestibular cochlear nerve, and grows within the auditory canal. Anacusis is total deafness. Conductive hearing loss, which is due to an impairment in the transmission of sound because of an obstruction of the ear canal or damage to the eardrum or ossicles. Meniere's disease. This is a rare disorder of unknown origin within the labyrinth of the inner ear that can lead to a progressive loss of hearing. Otitis Media. This is inflammation of the middle ear, which is commonly the result of an upper respiratory infection. Serous otitis media is a non-infectious inflammation of the middle ear with accumulation of serum, which is a clear fluid. We have suppurative otitis media, and this is inflammation of the middle ear with pus formation. Otosclerosis is a progressive deafness due to ossification in the bony labyrinth of the inner ear. Presbycusis is impairment of hearing that results from the aging process. Tinnitus is ringing or tingling noise heard constantly or intermittently in one or both ears, even in a quiet environment. And vertigo. This is the sensation of moving around in space or feeling a spinning or dizzy feeling. Okay, so we have reached the end of today's lecture, and for assignment number 18, I'd like for you to list the structures of the auditory system. Also, please list the structures of the vestibular system. What are the effects of aging on hearing? Describe static and dynamic equilibrium, and describe the common pathologies of the ear. Now, this assignment is due this coming Sunday at 11:55 p.m. If you have any difficulty with this assignment, please send me an email or shoot me a text message. My office hours are always the same, Thursdays from 4 to 6 p.m. And with that, I look forward to receiving your assignments, and I will see you in the next lecture.